ample notes. So. Okay, I think we're probably looking at the breakout rooms. I think we'll give it one more moment. Okay. So welcome everyone. So my name is John Andelfinger. I'm an instructor of English at SUNY Orange. And today's presentation is on student empowerment through demystifying assessment. So just a little bit of background, I primarily teach first-year composition, and most of my teaching experiences in first-year composition. So while I'm going to reference that quite a bit, that isn't the focus of the presentation. It's really a chance to use that as a framework that can hopefully apply to other disciplines. Okay. So this is just the session description from the program. I like having that in my slides. But largely what I want to focus on is this notion of formative and summative assessment and these terms, these two terms, and how teaching with these terms, I believe, is empowering to students. I think it specifically helps them understand the learning process and navigate the systems of higher education and things like that. Three main goals for the presentation. I'm going to be presenting strategies for discussing formative and summative assessment knowledge as well as practice in English composition. I'm going to demonstrate a peer review workshop model that is informed by student knowledge of formative feedback. And I'm also going to model differing forms of feedback for formative and summative feedback from instructors. So I'm trying to make this about the student experience as well as my own experience and kind of tie all these things together. A few terms, just so we're using the same terms and definitions and things like that. When I say rough draft, I am talking about an in-progress writing project. And when I say final draft, I mean it's been finalized and submitted. For formative assessment, I'm using this to mean assessment during the process of drafting a project and the accompanying feedback as well. And for summative assessment, it's simply after a project has been drafted. So my rationale, the reason I do this and the reason I'm presenting, I've been working in higher ed since 2012, and most of my time has been spent teaching first-year composition. But for 2.5 years, I was able to work as a director of assessment and accreditation. And during that time, I got a unique lens, I believe, on higher education. And I got to see how an institution practices assessment. This includes administrative assessment in my former position. It really changed the way I taught writing. And it became something that started informing my pedagogy more and more. I think that knowledge is profoundly rare in higher education, the knowledge of an institutional assessment practice. And I think that it gave me a unique way to approach writing instruction, and I hope I can share that with you today. Additionally, I want my students to know about formative and summative assessment and composition because they're getting feedback from me that's working in this framework. When they get rough draft feedback, it's formative assessment, and I'll talk about my summative assessment in a little bit. But also they're crafting feedback. They're crafting formative assessment feedback for their peers through peer reviews of drafts. So I think it's very important that they know these terms. I also think it's important because this applies to other disciplines and other areas of higher education. And I try to make it clear to them that their instructors, all their instructors know about assessment, they know about formative assessment and summative assessment. So having this knowledge gives them something they can take to a math class or a chemistry class. They can also take to some of their non-academic higher education experiences. So in my classes, I use a workshop structure. For all of my classes, I use a semester-long writing group model. So students work in small groups of roughly 4 to 6 students, and they work with the same peers for the entire semester. This is to help build trust, build camaraderie, and build a feeling of safety. If my students are in an asynchronous online class, this occurs during workshop week, which is the week before a final draft is due. But in all of them, what I'm trying to do is get them to provide 3 pieces of information. The first, I want them to tell their peers what works well in their draft. I also want them to tell them what might be changed. And I really guide them away from should statements or command statements. It's really what might be changed. We're trying to empower writers because this is formative feedback. And then any questions they have. This is, for me, understood as formative collaborative feedback. And because my students know these terms, they know formative assessment and formative feedback occurs during the learning process and during the writing process, they understand that this isn't a complete draft. I try to make sure that they understand that this feedback has to occur before my feedback. So they kind of handle their formative assessment, then I take over with my formative assessment, and it helps them finalize a draft. I think this also disrupts this dichotomy of formative and summative assessment. Generally, I consider, this is a personal viewpoint on assessment, but I consider all feedback to occur during first-year composition courses to be at least partially formative, because projects lead to other projects, and the writing done in composition class hopefully informs practices beyond our class together. To kind of see this visually, I made this small model. This is a typical or common model you'll see in first-year composition, where we have a rough draft, there's an instructor providing formative feedback, there's a final draft, and then we kind of stop with the summative feedback. And I try to help my students imagine this in a different way. So there's a rough draft, there's instructor and peer feedback, which is formative. Then there's a final draft. That feedback in the final draft, it only comes from me at this point, the last arrow over here. But that is both formative and summative because it speaks to the next project, the next rough draft. In assessment circles, we talk about closing the loop all the time. And this is the way I try to close the loop for all of my students, by showing them that all the feedback is formative in some way. A little bit of relevant literature I want to go over. So James points out the contingent faculty have opportunities to collaborate with many people across campuses through assessment practice to better reach students. And I think these suggestions can be expanded really to include students. I think students can be part of our conversations with assessment. I don't see any reason why these cross-campus conversations should be among, frankly, among the employees. I think that the people who are coming to our campus and who are asking us to read their writing and assess their math skills and assess all their skills across all the disciplines, I think that they should be involved in these conversations and involved in collaborative efforts. So I thought that James's study was pretty important. Also, Anson Davis and El-Khoury suggest collaborating with students to design project criteria. This is a common practice in composition, where you'll discuss a project and then say, these are the traits of a successful project, or these are the traits of good writing. I think that these practices, they can provide formative assessment of the course and specific pedagogical practices. So Anson Davis and El-Khoury point this out, that by collecting this information, by collaborating with students about project criteria, it's really a form of formative assessment for us on our courses. They also provide guidance for how to discuss project traits. And I think that can be connected to the previous notion from James about how to really bring students into the conversation. If students are able to discuss assessment in a course, then they can discuss it beyond the course as well. Now, Corus and Paul examined the impact of COVID-19 on assessment, and they found evidence of increased student participation in assessment practices and also discussion in language and communication classes. And I think that this mixed method study shows that we have an opportunity right now. This might be a particularly poignant time to bring students into discussions about assessment. If the pandemic has shifted some of the ways in which we discuss assessment and specifically brought students into conversation with people they previously weren't in conversation with on the topic of assessment, then we may have an opportunity right now to do this kind of work on the student level or on the class level, as well as in groups beyond the class. Also, Nary, Davis, and Hurley, they promote a model of formative assessment with creative modules within a course, and they specifically argue that formative assessment that is unrelated to grades should be used in creative practices. And the summative assessment often doesn't apply to creative endeavors. I like this model because it really looks at first-year students. As someone who teaches composition, again, that's the bulk of my students. They are first-year students. They are new to higher education, many of them, and I think that, again, this suggestion from these authors, it points out that we really should look at opportunities to separate assessment and grading for first-year students who are new to the academy. Now, I also practice audio feedback, so I want to go over a little tiny bit of research about that. In 2012, Silva noted that audiovisual feedback provided through Camtasia was more aligned with what we call global feedback, or feedback about the entire paper instead of small things like grammar, syntax, citation. There's more local issues that are small, like sentence level feedback. So Silva noted that audiovisual feedback is more aligned with global feedback, and that many students prefer that modality because of the global nature. Additionally, Bilbro, Iluzada, and Clark used audio and written feedback and then actually let students pick their preferred modality. Okay, so I'm trying to demystify a lot of this for students and give them more choices, and that's a great study for that. Finally, Chalfin notes that audio feedback has unique affordances related to encouraging students and showing them care for their writing, that we have genuine, authentic care for what they've written and their writing journey. So all of this coalesces, this notion of, kind of sharing the discussion of assessment and disrupting feedback patterns into my practice in my class. So for formative feedback in my classes, I encourage students to provide feedback to their peers that is formative. They're introduced to the definitions of formative assessment and summative assessment in class. And then they're made aware of how the rough draft, ideally the rough draft occurs during the learning process or during the drafting process. So they're asked to provide feedback that specifically attends to this. It attends to the moment that draft exists. So the formative assessment is provided by peers and by me. And I like to think that that allows for more diverse voices in the formative experience my students have. For summative feedback, I provide audio feedback. And I've started comparing my audio feedback and my written feedback, and I've found that my audio commentary, it aligns with the scholarship. It is more global. It's less local. And I think this also aligns well with summative assessment. It's after the draft. Very few students, I've asked in a lot of my classes, do any of them work on projects after the final draft? And many of them don't. That didn't come as a surprise to me, but many of them don't. And I think that this is an opportunity to kind of take that idea that, okay, you're not going to pick up the draft, but let's talk about the next project, because I've sequenced these projects intentionally. These projects do build upon one another. And if my audio feedback can attend to that, if I can mention the next project, the upcoming project, future writing, even after first year composition courses, in that way, the final draft feedback gets to be both summative and formative. And because they know these terms from my previous lectures on these concepts, because I know these terms, they know what I'm doing. It's not this random, English professor giving them information that does random things. It's informed. If you go back to my title, it was demystifying this work. And I think that by helping students understand intentionality behind my feedback, and I talk with them about audio feedback versus written feedback, they're going to get written feedback with in-text notes for their rough draft. They're going to get audio feedback, and it's going to look forward to future projects. I try to make it clear to them what I'm doing, to slow down and tell them why I'm doing what I'm doing. All of this brings me to empowerment. I believe that this model empowers students with knowledge of assessment, which is really important. It's important due to the way assessment impacts their educational journey. When we work with first-year students, any of you who work with first-year students, there's often a lot of newness. There's a lot of newness to the institution, but also just to higher education in general. And I think that we sometimes forget that students and their experiences are being continually assessed in a variety of ways. In my previous position, I helped all sorts of areas of the university assess their efficacy, assess student learning, but also I helped athletics assess their reaching out to student athletes. I helped financial aid assess how they were providing services to students. These processes are occurring all over. And I think students deserve to know that this is happening. It's often occurring in the background, but we can bring it to the foreground to give them more agency. The next thing, I think this model provides opportunity for increased writing agency, to make it really about their writing. Through the crafting of feedback, they learn to be assessors. If they learn to assess their students, their peers' drafts, they also learn to assess their own. I firmly believe that. And I think that it creates that cohesive, trust-based environment that I'm looking to bring into a composition course. Finally, by using audio feedback for summative feedback, I demonstrate genuine care about their writing, and also for their writing practices in future. It's important for me that students know that their words matter, that they took the time to put words on a page, and that I took the time, that their instructor took the time to read those words and genuinely celebrate the work. I consider myself to be an adept writer. I'd like to think that with my job title I am, but for me, there's something about audio feedback. They get to hear my tone of voice. They get to hear me celebrate and get excited about their writing. And I just can't do that as effectively in written feedback. So I found that audio feedback and the background behind it, telling them why I do it, has really helped empower students because they know someone cares. So questions. I was trying to stick to around the 20-minute mark. And I would love to discuss this with people if anyone has ideas, questions, anything like that. Oh, I see there are some questions in the chat. I couldn't see the chat while I was presenting, so this is great. Oh, someone from SUNY Binghamton. That's wonderful. Hello. Okay, what tools do I use for audio feedback? So currently I use the in-LMS system. So we use Brightspace at SUNY. So I use what's an embedded audio tool within the Brightspace system. And I'm very concerned with privacy. So whenever there's an available audio tool within the LMS, I prefer to use that. In the past, I've used Blackboard and also Canvas effectively to provide audio feedback. They also have audio tools. Sometimes you kind of have to find the tool, or sometimes there's a plugin that's required from IT. But I find that the audio tool in Brightspace works very well. I'm very happy with it. And Brightspace, by the way, is owned by D2L. So depending on your school, you may also know it under another name. But most LMSs have this somehow aligned with like the assignment within the grade book or something like that. In the past, I have tried using an audio program like a digital audio interface and providing sound files that way, but it really does speed things up when it's embedded. Now, the previous research in my presentation, I mentioned that there's research on the use of video, Camtasia specifically. Some LMSs now have that available as well. So you can actually open a student's file and create a video of you talking through the file. This is heavily supported by Scott Warnock's work also. Scott Warnock wrote the book, Teaching Writing Online, published through NCTE. And he goes through some options for how to do that as well. By being able to walk through the document and highlight text and even manipulate a Word document or Google Docs document with audio, right? This isn't just moving things around and providing comments, but with audio is a really nice tool if it's available. A lot of that, again, with privacy considerations, LMS, the more I do this, the more I don't want to leave the LMS. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, Rob asked, how are students trained to give feedback, or are they modeling your feedback? Excellent question, Rob. Thank you. So in terms of training the feedback, I really use the guiding questions. So I may have gone over this a little too quickly, but in the workshop, I asked them for 3 questions. And I can share this in just a moment. So, okay. So I asked for these 3 questions. What works well in their group mates drafts? What might be changed in their group mates drafts? And then any questions they have for their group mates. So I try to get them to actually do this in a discussion board. My students post drafts to a discussion board. I open up threads and they're asked to write these out. I'm trying to keep them away from peer editing. So there's peer review and peer editing. And I find most of my students show up with ample experience with peer editing, finding issues with commas and spell checking and things like that. But largely, I'm trying to move my students away from that. It's the writer's responsibility to edit their work as far as as far as I try to teach. And also, my class isn't a grammar class. I'm more concerned with the content of the writing than how it's presented in terms of grammar and syntax and things like that. So by using these questions and asking them to write back in the discussion board, I've helped move them away from, check your spelling and things like that. And then I give my feedback afterwards. So I give the students the chance to do their in-class, workshop, and they provide feedback to one another, and then I provide feedback. And I stopped doing it concurrently. I used to do it, just whenever it fit my schedule that week. I stopped doing it because I noticed some of my feedback, like my feedback to student A, would often inform what student A provided to student B. There was kind of this model that got passed on. So I try not to do that anymore. It does require a little bit of careful time management on my part, but it's worked out largely, I think, to benefit my students. So they get to provide feedback, then they get feedback from me, then they revise. I hope that answers your question thoroughly. Okay. Are there any other questions? Any other things we'd like to discuss?
John, I'll come on here. I'll model your audio.
Oh, thank you.
Writing it.
Thank you.
Because I'm having a tough time exactly articulating what my question is. But first, I wanted to say thank you. This has been really enlightening for me, and I teach kind of in a similar setup, but basically it's in an interdisciplinary community studies program. So where basically students are either working individually or together to develop some kind of a community-based project. So it's kind of the cold notes of that. And I've kind of dabbled in, I'm still early in my career, and dabbling in kind of trying to encourage students to do peer review. And all my classes are synchronous and they're mainly in person. So there's probably some different dynamics there. But I'm just wondering if you've noticed trends over the years where maybe either individual students or like maybe a whole section or whole class maybe don't take that first draft seriously. So they might, just to be blunt, like do something for the 30 seconds before class starts and then treat that as their peer review. So, or the document that they bring to the peer review. So I'm wondering, have you found have you been able to create a culture that students take that first draft seriously? Is that the success, or are there other strategies you kind of use so that first draft they're hopefully submitting is at least somewhat there's a strong version of their work to move forward with?
Yeah, that's a great question, Simon, and it is part of my kind of ongoing journey through this. I do find, especially for the first project, there is often a little bit of trepidation with how, what is a rough draft and how do we define a rough draft? And I do try to encourage students to bring the project in wherever they are. That a rough draft doesn't have to be a finalized draft. If it's incomplete, try to give some notes. Tell your group, what are you still working with? Why is the draft incomplete? Do you not know how to wrap it up? Are you having trouble with the framing of some paragraphs? So I try to get them to, again, build this conversation. Admittedly, it often takes me until project 2 or 3 for everything to coalesce. And part of that's the building trust component of working with semester-long groups. It's also why I don't use different groups each project, because then they spend time introducing themselves and then they have to feel safe. And I find that the drafts do get better as they just get used to one another. Now, beyond that, the other thing I've noticed just from conversations, this is strictly anecdotal, but a lot of my students, they do struggle with getting legitimate feedback. Previous instructors often gave them largely grammar-based feedback. And, it's not a slight on other educators. It's just my class is more about content. I focus on the content of the paper over the grammar. And there is, I think, a little bit of a shakeup that occurs for some of them. But once they understand that these are what I'm trying to create is writers respectfully discussing one another's work and building that environment of respect and trust, the drafts get better and better because I think they feel safe taking a risk. The other thing I did neglect to mention, and I thought of this during David's presentation about a half hour ago, how do I grade this stuff? I didn't put it in my slides. So I actually use labor-based grading for rough drafts. Their rough draft is entirely graded on submitting their draft to me and their group and submitting feedback to their group. So as long as they do the work, as long as they provide feedback to everyone and give me the opportunity to provide them feedback, they get full credit. And I think that turns down some of the pressure for what a rough draft has to be. I really do want them to bring in that rough draft that needs help. And maybe it is incomplete, but if that's where they are in that moment in time, that's where I want to meet them. And then we also just have conversations. I don't know if you're, if the interdisciplinary subject provides this opportunity, but I talk a lot about the craft and this arc of what a writing project looks like. And I think helping them understand that I write first drafts and sometimes those rough drafts are incomplete and how I build, I think it helps them understand that the better the draft they can bring to the workshop, the better their final draft is going to be, because they're just getting more data. It's just a data question at that point.
Awesome.
Does that
Very
help,
good.
Simon?
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Yeah.